But for fascism, there is no distinction whatsoever. The leader is just connected to God in ways that you are not, or I'm not. And the question of whether one agrees with the leader or not becomes a question of faith. Of course, that legitimizes and facilitates the violence. Because now it's not a disagreement that you or me have, but rather who is with God and who is not with God.
It's amazing to see so many of you here this evening, which is a testament to how important the subject of this talk is to many of you, and I imagine also the speaker that many of you would know about. And it's a great pleasure and privilege to introduce him and the subject of his talk this evening. The last 2 decades, ever since the great financial crash of 2008, have witnessed the rise of populists in most parts of the world. In broad strokes, populists of all stripes claim to embody the will of the people. Politically, they seek to concentrate executive power, weakening the separation of powers in independent political institutions, and they often justify these power grabs by the need to act decisively. Ideologically, populists often champion the need to restore political sovereignty of the nation vis-à-vis footloose capital and the global economy. Yet there are important differences amongst populists. In general, populists on the left define the people in terms of class, championing the interests of workers, ordinary citizens, the poorer majority. In contrast, populists on the right defend the rights of settlers, or the racial and ethnic majority of a nation, casting them often as the so-called natural citizens vis-à-vis immigrants, minorities, and indeed even indigenous peoples. They often pit conservative or reactionary values against liberal, feminist, or socialist ideals. And many style themselves as strong men, reviving old tropes of hypermasculinity that encourage a greater willingness to use intimidation, coercion, and even violence to achieve their political goals. So this has led to a fierce debate that many of us are familiar with. How should we characterize populism in the 21st century? What relations, if any, does it have with its 20th century cousin? What explains the rise of and support for populists, particularly those that style themselves as autocratic strongmen in recent years? What about fascism? Do right-wing populists today represent a new form of fascist politics? If so, what lessons from the rise of 20th century fascism must we apply to protect democracy in the 21st? Or are such comparisons a dangerous exaggeration that actually amplifies the polarization and instability we fear? Our guest this evening has spent his career studying these questions. Federico Finchelstein is a University in Exile research professor and professor of history at the New School, where he directs the Janey program in Latin American studies, and where I was lucky to be a colleague of his for many years before moving to Toronto. A renowned comparative historian who specializes in Europe and Latin America, Professor Finchelstein is the author of 8 books, many of which have been translated into Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Chinese, Hungarian, Korean, and Turkish. These include Fascist Mythologies, The History and Politics of Unreason in Borges, Freud, and Schmidt, A Brief History of Fascist Lies, From Fascism to Populism in History, The Ideological Origins of the Dirty War, and Transatlantic Fascism. A prolific multilingual scholar committed to public engagement, Professor Finchelstein has published more than 50 articles and reviews and edited volumes in specialized peer-reviewed journals in the United States, the UK, Mexico, the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Israel, Brazil, and Argentina. You have to publish now in India. He also contributes to major American, European, and Latin American newspapers and media, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Clarín in Argentina, Folha de São Paulo in Brazil, the Corriere della Sera in Italy, and Mediapart in France, just to name a few. His latest book, the subject of his presentation this evening, is Wannabe Fascists, a guide to understanding the greatest threat to democracy. Federico will make some opening remarks for about 20 minutes. I'll then start a conversation with him to explore some of the themes and arguments in his new book, and we'll end with enough time for questions and answers from all of you here on the floor. Please join me in welcoming Professor Federico Finchelstein.
Well, thank you so much for your very kind presentation. It's such a pleasure to be here in Toronto, in Canada. I think it's my second time in Toronto and time number 3 in Canada. And as I said, I'm very thankful for Professor Ruparelia for having invited me. And I'm very happy, although I'm happy to be here, happy to talk with you, but I'm not going to talk about a happy topic. Which is, what an historian like myself, who in my case, I have been studying fascism, populism, authoritarians, dictators, racists, and anti-Semites for the last 30 years. So I am kind of used to find like this kind of contradiction between, let's say, a passion for thinking about these issues and the realization that sometimes, or most of the times, these issues are quite depressing. And yet, the idea that I share with many, with all social scientists, of course, but also with many historians in particular, is that history has something to say about the present and offer even some lessons from the past. Now, to get into one of the questions that I have asked myself, not only as an historian, but also as a citizen, and maybe you ask yourself the same question, I will start with this question, which is Donald Trump a fascist? I asked myself that question many, many times. And I push myself to answer as an historian, not only as a person that as a citizen is actively against these kind of politicians. So, but I think what is really what I can contribute, in addition to voting and protesting and doing other things as a citizen, I think as an historian and myself, as an expert on fascism and populism, there is something to be said about what's going on. And I will try to give an answer, or I will share my answer to this question a couple of times during my talk, which I was talking with Professor Ruparelia that I wanted this talk to be brief so we can have more time for conversation. Now, the question of Trump and leaders like him, and again, like people like Trump doing the politics that Trump or someone like Trump is doing, the president of my country, Milei, until recently Bolsonaro in Brazil, Narendra Modi in India, and Orban used to be, or until recently, the leader, the leading figure in Hungary, and these kind of politicians that are not the typical populist politicians. My argument is that rather than being the typical populist politicians, and I will return to a more detailed approach to this, but I will say it now, is rather than being the typical populist politicians, they are closer to what fascist politicians used to be, used to do, used to believe in, and yet they are not exactly that. So the title of my last book, which is my one-liner answer to the question, is that they are wannabe fascists. That they are not there yet, but also they are not the typical politicians that we witnessed in the past. So basically, my answer to the question, I will just say it and then explain why, which I think the explanation is more important than the answer. But in Spanish, we can say, again, is Donald Trump a fascist? And in Spanish, I will say ni, which is kind of yes and no. But I think, this is a more measured response vis-a-vis, a debate about the fascism of Trump and people like him that sometimes had led into kind of essentialist ideas, especially among those that see no line of continuity, among those that see that there is no connection whatsoever, and actually people like Trump represent more of the same, that they engage in this kind of all or nothing approach to the issue, misunderstanding what historical comparisons and transnational histories are about. I mean, if we ask the question differently, more specifically, is Trump exactly like Hitler? The answer will be no. I mean, to even go more specific, do they share the same mustache? No, but it doesn't matter. The question is how close they are in their politics. One of the issues, when you approach this issue as an historian, is exactly how much continuity, how much discontinuity. And of course, history is about continuities and discontinuities, changes and continuities. But if we ask the characters themselves, of course, they will say that they are unique, that there was nothing like them before, and they represent a turning point in history. In fact, Trump himself, the president of one of my two countries, I'm also an American citizen, Trump himself has said that he wanted to call, no surprise here, this new era, or he called it a new era, the age of Trump. Now, is he right? In a way, yes. I mean, there are things that are new, at least in terms of, from the position of somebody in power. I mean, people like him, people acting in extreme ways, they were always there, but not necessarily inside the White House and leading the most powerful country in the world. And yet, when we go back to the F word, to the question of whether he's a fascist or not, then the question becomes more complicated. Now, if you ask me, so I have started working, I always work on fascism and dictators and populism and racist. But if you ask me, I wouldn't say 30 years ago, but even, I would say 15 years ago, if you ask me, can you explain why you don't think that Trump is yet a fascist, or can you explain what fascism is? And can you tell me the difference between fascism and populism? I would have said, you have maybe an hour so we can talk about this. Even better, if you have time, can you take my course and we dedicate a semester, as I do, to studying this question? But then I realized that was not, is the typical scholarly approach to these questions, which is okay for the context of a seminar, and yet I think scholars, we have a responsibility. And when people are asking this question to me, especially outside the academy, and again, like many of you, I am an academic, little part of my life is inside the academy, but my life, it's also outside the academy. I don't live in the academy, I live in my house. And I go to different places, I talk with people in different spheres of life. And I really respect the question, and I also understand that there is no time. People are busy, they don't have time for taking a seminar, all the students do. And I thought, how is it possible to explain this, well, for example, in a 20-minute talk, without betraying what we historians believe is the complexity of history? Because at the end of the day, in history there would always be an answer, which is continuity and change. And the question in different historical interpretations is how much of each. There is no such thing as totally new, as in life, but also especially in history, or totally different. So I thought, when I wrote my book on From Fascism to Populism in History, I thought, although it was a long book, in a way, I have written also short books, but, or at least for my standards, was a long book. But I thought I was, respecting the complexity by providing an answer, which I will share. And yet I felt it's not enough. I felt I couldn't, explain my book, and this was my fault, or maybe the fault of the book. I couldn't explain it in 2 minutes. And I really pushed myself in a way that, drawing back on all my work, but also the work of many colleagues, to write a book in which I can at the same time, have a reader dedicate hours to it, or hours to listen to it, because it's also an audiobook, And I'm told that the person that is, you will not hear my accent, is a nicer accent, I guess. But the person even impersonates Trump, something I would not do today. So when I quote Trump, I will talk like me, not like him. But the audiobook has that fun dimension to it too. But the point is that I thought, how I can answer this question? And basically my answer is like to give it, like again, now I will provide it again, it's a ni, it's a yes and no. But in the book, in the last book, I focus on 4 pillars of fascism. Meaning, this is not a definition of fascism. Fascism was way many more things than that. But without these 4 things, fascism is not fascism. And in the book, I wrote 4 chapters, 1 for each pillar. And I'm way more interested in the same way that I hope is the case today, in the reader coming to their own conclusions about whether they think this kind of new type of politician, which I call wannabe fascist, correlates to the past or not. So for me, that is way more interesting than the answer that I give, which is typical historianese, which is very complex, yes and no. So people can be frustrated about that, but maybe it's like choose your own, like what is the title of this series? I read them when I was a child. Choose your own story or choose your own. Okay, well, it could be like that. So these 4 elements are, first, violence and the militarization of politics. There is, of course, violence and militarization of politics in many ideologies, in many movements and regimes. And by the way, fascism can be 3 different things. And only a few times in history, it has been these 3 things all, at the same time. Fascism can be an ideology. Maybe you can have even, in a small island, a fascism of one. A person that is a fascist ideologue or believes in fascist ideas. In other cases, more dangerous, obviously, for democracy, fascism becomes a mass movement, a movement. And in fewer cases, fascism becomes a regime. So, of course, you can have ideologies, movements, and regimes with violence and the militarization of politics. That's my pillar number 1. But there is a specific take that fascism had on violence and the militarization of politics. I will mention 2 dimensions, and then in the conversation, maybe if you want, we can return to this, or whatever you have in mind, we can also address. The first one is that, of course, all ideologies, regimes, and movements are violent, but most ideologies will understand violence, of course, as a source of power. Without violence, there is no power, according to most theories of politics and power, starting with this, very classic theory, which is that of Max Weber, who said, you need, in order to be powerful, you need the monopoly of violence. But Weber concluded, then the person that is, or the leader, or the movement, or the regime, the state that is powerful, is the one that has the monopoly of violence, but doesn't use it. That's a powerful person, or a powerful regime. And in a way, like liberalism, conservatism, communism, they kind of agree on that one. Fascists here disagree, because not only they believe that violence is a source of power, but only one is powerful when that violence is unleashed. So the idea with a fascist ideology, movement, and regime to wait for the calm waters to happen, that will never happen. Because the idea is constant conflict and constant violence is the source of their idea of how they are powerful. In fact, they believe that people that are not violent, that's what Mussolini and Hitler said, or many others, in Latin America and in many other places, peoples that are not violent are weak. They are democracies. I mean, democracies for them was a bad word, of course. So that's the first element. The militarization of politics, which is connected to this ideology, is an ideological take. I mean, of course, that is not necessarily true. It's just what they think about power and politics. But the outcome of that is, of course, a very dangerous outcome for all those that do not agree with these ideas. Now, on a practical level, this means that they understand politics as another war, as another kind of situation that can be resolved with violence. Historically, this means that domestic violence is predominant during fascism, even before they become a regime, and basically you will see paramilitary formations, people that actually are not soldiers or members of the military dress in costumes as if they were soldiers, even worse, men with guns, and they will do, violence in the streets. And eventually, when they become the states, they are incorporated into the state, and often without identification, they will go around killing people. So both, for example, like in the two most famous fascist regimes, in Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, all these party formations, paramilitary groups of guys who were no connection to the state, they were incorporated as sort of a military situation of the state. They became the state. Eventually in fascism, that internal violence is externalized into total war. So that's element number one. And maybe I have like 4 minutes, so I will have to, 5, okay. I will rush now, and then we can talk more. Second element, and I wrote a book on that, because I was very interested in that. I'm not bragging, I just said like I was very interested in that, that's why I wrote the book. It's lies and propaganda. And here again, it's not only an issue of quantity, fascists lie a lot. But not only that, there is the qualitative issue. They believe their lies. And even worse, they want to transform the world, our world, they want to transform reality in order for reality to be like their lies. I will give you one example, extreme example, awful example, from the Holocaust. Nazis believe that, and it was a fake belief, obviously a lie, they believed that Jews were dirty and spread disease. This is a lie, a huge lie. But what did they do with this lie? You cannot prove this lie. What did they do? They put their Jewish victims in ghettos and concentration camps with horrible sanitary conditions. And these people, these poor victims, they will become dirty and eventually they will be ill and maybe spread disease. And a Nazi will say, I told you. No, you didn't. You are transforming the world in order for the world to be like your lies. And that is maybe one of the most dangerous dimensions of this, the denial of reality, but not only the denial of reality, but the transformation of reality. That's element number 2. Element number 3, politics of xenophobia. The absolute enemy of fascism. There is no fascism without this. In fact, all fascisms were racist, all of them. The question is which was the enemy or how it was defined. And then this idea of the absolute enemy that needs to be destroyed. Persecuted, first identified, persecuted, and eventually killed. And last but not least, dictatorship. There are many dictatorships without fascism, but there is no fascism without dictatorship. Fascism is about dictatorship, and even more so, and we can talk later about this, permanent dictatorship. There were many dictatorships in history before, but not like the fascist dictatorships. For example, for the classic type of dictatorship, the Roman dictatorship, it was constitutional in a way, because it was a parenthesis in times of emergency, in times of war. They call a dictator, and eventually the dictator had to go. Sometimes it didn't work that well. Caesar or others, they had an issue with leaving, but there were problems too. Lenin and communism, and before that, the French Revolution, their idea of a dictatorial government was, at least in theory, not in practice, in theory presented as there is a dictatorship of the proletariat, Lenin said, but eventually we will not have a dictatorship. So a dictatorship as means. Whereas the fascists, they came to power and they were not about dictatorship as means. As in the case of violence, it was an end in and out of itself. This is not to return. This is not a time of emergency, and we need the dictatorship for just a little bit to return to normal democratic times. So this is what fascism was about. I will say 2 more lines about populism and then reach the wannabe fascists of today. Populism. Populism, basically, after fascism was defeated in 1945, fascism, at least in terms of a power regime or a regime of power, was not, so my phone is telling me to shut up, actually, so I will shut up very soon. So basically what happened with populism is that people that were dictators and people that were fascists, actually, first in Latin America and then in other places, they kind of renounce key elements of fascism, in fact, these 4 pillars, in order to create authoritarian anti-liberal democracies. They remain authoritarian, but they left racism behind. Racism was not, or xenophobia was not at the center of their politics. Certainly not violence. And even more importantly, they lie like other politicians. To put it diplomatically, as first Cuomo said in New York, I campaign in poetry, I rule in prose. Yeah, you kind of lie, as everybody else, like promising things that they cannot do, but this is typical of politics. We can go to ancient times for proof of that. Very different, as I said, how the fascists lie. Populists, they lie like other politicians. They didn't want to transform reality. They didn't believe their lies. Now, the most important element, and I will finish with this, is dictatorship. As you know, in the most important cases of fascism, fascists use democracy and democratic means to destroy democracy from within. In fact, in history, when fascists tried to do this with conservative dictators, it didn't work. They only work, with the freedoms that we have in democracy. The paradox, of course, is that they use those freedoms to destroy freedom. They use those rights to destroy political rights. So they were quite effective in doing that, and they, destroy democracy from within to create a dictatorship from the top. Now, what the populists did first in Latin America after 45. And one of my cases is my compatriot, Juan Domingo Perón. Perón was a strongman in a military dictatorship. He was a fascist. But then he did the opposite. He destroyed the dictatorship from the top, called for elections, which he won, and created a democracy from the top, which had, and this is important, electoral legitimacy as its center. So he was authoritarian. Yes, he changed, one province became province, Juan Domingo Perón. Imagine if here we have, as maybe my president might hope, Ontario becomes Donald J. Trump state or whatever. Perón did that in Argentina, and his wife, Eva Perón, or Evita, she had her state or province too. But Perón will say, you don't like this, vote me out. So you see this kind of authoritarianism, many other things too, but electoral legitimacy. Now, I thought when I wrote my book, and I will finish with this, on fascism and populism, this was my argument, how fascism changed to populism. And I thought I was done with this, and I thought this is my refuge, go back to work on the fascists from the 20s and 30s, no more Trump in my head, no more research on these recent events. And then January 6th happened. And that's when I decided to write my book, because what I saw in January 6th is the renunciation of a key dimension of populism, which is the need to have electoral legitimacy. Because had Trump prevailed in his attempt at denying the electoral results and remain in power, technically, this is not a conceptual discussion, technically he would have been a dictator, technically. If you stay in power without electoral support, you are not a democratic president, obviously. So that's when, when I was thinking all this, I wrote, and this is like something strange, because historians, we are not supposed to be good with the future, but I wrote an article in the Washington Post saying, if he keeps saying this will eventually lead to a coup d'etat, meaning denying the elections, and then January 6th happened. And at one point I was called, I received a request from a now defunct, of course, Congressional Commission investigating January 6th, the American Congress trying to deal with its past, And I was called, and with a colleague who actually now is a professor at Toronto, Jason Stanley, we wrote together this report, talking about the connections with fascism, between the present and fascism, and that's why eventually I used my part of that report as the script for the book that I'm presenting now. So thank you very much.
So there's a lot in this book. It's a terrific book. It's a short book. You can read it very quickly, and it's packed with these layers of history and comparison, which are global, north-south, at multiple levels in the way in which you get a sense of just listening to Federico. So congratulations on the book. I really urge everyone to read some of this work because it's very insightful. So I was thinking we could divide our conversation before we open it up into sort of two sections. So first, let's dig in a little bit more into fascism historically and populism, which you've traced, and then to talk about the present, the so-called wannabe fascists. So Federico said there are four main pillars of fascism historically, right? So extreme violence, militarization of politics, lies, propaganda, but the big lie in particular, politics of xenophobia, and dictatorship. And one thing that's really striking in his argument is, as he touched upon, is that violence is integral to politics, modern politics. You try to contain it, you try to control it, and so on, but it's at the base of power, ultimately in the final instance. But what is striking about fascism is that it's power for its own sake, and violence actually not power for its own sake, it's violence for its own sake. And you say that fascists sort of think of violence they exercise violence preemptively. They say that they're threatened by their opponents, who they cast as enemies to be destroyed, and so they act preemptively, saying it's an imaginary threat, but we're going to vanquish them before they vanquish us. And they also find violence, the exercise of violence, almost moral, cleansing, which is a very dark, obviously, reality. So what explains that? This way of thinking about violence that they justify using it preemptively, and they see it almost like as a moral imperative to use violence.
Yes, and again, here it is important at the same time that we see certain dimensions of this broadly in society, we need also to pay attention to the fact that in this particular issue, they are very specific and not everybody shares their view, obviously. So, there is one element which they combine, and again, in a very problematic way, is the relationship between aesthetics and morality. So violence is beautiful and thereby is correct or ethical, which is a big, leap. Because first, not necessarily is beautiful, and secondly, why something beautiful becomes something right or correct. So this kind of conflation between aesthetics and ethics is central to fascism. Now, of course, in society, then and now, there is a kind of fascination with violence. We see this in movies, we see this in many dimensions. On the other hand, what is specific about, I'm not even critical of that at this point, or that's not what I want to criticize, is that we need to always remember that fascism is not like a kind of a musical brand or only an aesthetic brand, but it's politics. This is a project to rule people. It's a project to dominate others, and it's a project to oppress people. So the question is, and the same happens, by the way, with another key dimension of this violence, which is presented as sacred, which is, of course, the fascist appropriation of religion, to the extent that some scholars talk about fascism as a political theology or even a political religion. But then you wonder, how could it be religion is one thing and politics is another? Maybe. But here there is maybe many people wonder how much of a distinction should be made between the two, and it's a political discussion in every society and every country. But for fascism, there is no distinction whatsoever. The leader is just connected to God in ways that you are not, or I'm not, and the question of whether one agrees with the leader or not becomes a question of faith. Of course, that legitimizes and facilitates the violence. Because now it's not a disagreement that you or me have, but rather who is with God and who is not with God. And of course, the leader is closer to God, even to the extent that the leader becomes God. Now, some people were shocked that Trump, will compare himself, to a doctor, but the rest of us thought that he was comparing himself to Jesus. But Hitler, for example, will do that all the time, even in the worst moments. I mean, Hitler, considered himself a prophet, but of course, a prophet of acts of things that he will do. So, and this is incredible. Like in January 1939, a few months before the start of the Second World War, he went to the Reichstag, to Congress, and he said, "Once again, I will be a prophet. If we start," he said, I'm quoting now, "if the Jews start a war, that war, I promise, will not end with our destruction, but with the exterminations of the Jews." So he said that. Now, he was not the typical prophet because he did everything in his power to make that a reality. So you see that kind of combination, which is catastrophic if you are more interested in rights, inequality, and democracy, because this leads to the total inability to understand others, and of course dehumanization. So all these comparisons of people to animals or other animals or insects or objects. So that is a key element in fascism that sadly, I see as a continuity with the present.
So you've touched on the politics of xenophobia, particularly in extreme form, which is about the hatred of others and the dehumanization. And both of those conceptions are absolute, right? So actually what's striking about fascism as an ideology, as a movement, of course then as a regime, is it's absolutist in several ways, right? That it's a celebration and glorification of violence for absolute reasons, in and of itself. Dictatorship. The dictatorship is permanent, absolute. It's not a transition, not temporary. It's extra-legal. So that, I think, is familiar to a lot of us. One thing I was struck by in the book is the second pillar, lies and propaganda. So again, lies and propaganda is part of modern politics, lesser or greater degree. What's striking about the fascists, according to you, is that the leaders of fascist movements believe their lies, and their followers believe their lies because they're matters of myth. They're not subject to empirical tests. They can't be disproven easily. It's a closed system, an ideological circuit, where you believe a certain premise and you deductively you deduce from that premise that this is how the world is, even if there are facts against it. But then at the same time in your book, in that second chapter, you say that on the one hand, leaders believe their lies. On the other hand, they're dishonest. And if they're dishonest, that implies that they also realize they're telling a lie. And they're manipulating. They're manipulating the truth, or actually telling falsehoods, in order to mobilize people. So tell us briefly a little bit about that. There's sort of a tension in that, the politics of telling lies and falsehoods in this tradition. That on the one hand you believe it, on the other hand you kind of know you don't. But you use it instrumentally to manipulate, mobilize, to sow dissent, and so on.
Yes, I mean, the question is, again, that I'm not a fascist, obviously. I mean, I'm an historian of fascism, not a fascist historian, big difference. But the point is, like, it's important to make that distinction because, often fascists choose to think in a different way.
Right.
In a way that makes their own things sacred and thereby unavailable for the rest of us in terms of critique. So, for example, one of the most important Latin American fascists, a guy that I have been studying for a long time, the name is Leopoldo Lugones. He said something very interesting in this regard. He says, it's not that we deny empirical reality, but we believe in a reality that transcends empirical reality and is the reality of our political faith. And how, I mean, and then like, you know, I will keep saying, because I would like to be a very rational person, so how can you prove it? That's not the point.
It's a matter of faith.
It's a matter of faith. And I always, you know, tell my students, if I could take a time machine and I could talk with Hitler, which is a weird project, right? And I'm Jewish, so probably he will kill me very soon before I can ask a question. But let's say he doesn't, and I can ask my question. And I said, I will ask him, you say that you are the leader of Germany forever, that you are, and you know what the German people want all the time. And how do you know, because they are not voting against you next year, how do you know that you still are the personification of the German people, the embodiment of the people and the nation? How could it be? And of course, again, before killing me, he will insult me. I'm pretty sure he will say, Federico, you are such an idiot. Because you have what he will call the idiotic democratic understanding of political legitimacy, which is, I believe that the legitimacy of a leader is related to people choosing. But that is not part of the fascist model. The idea is that there is a moment, which we don't know exactly when, maybe when the leader was born, it was already a predestination, that the leader always was the leader of the people, even before it acquired power by democratic means in some cases. And then that will stand forever. And thereby you see all these fantasies about a leader living 1,000 years, you know, a 1,000-year Reich, or I don't know if you saw these like AI images of Trump, you know, living 1,000 years. But this is typical of mystic movements. You can go to the Middle Ages, for example, and you see, you know, I share the same name, Frederick, sort of, Red Bear, the idea that king could never die. I mean, this is mystic belief. It's the world of faith translated into politics. And again, for those that do not agree, or they are, of course, they are rendered unfaithful, I mean, the situation could become very problematic, as it happened during fascism, that it was something that you just don't belong. So, I mean, this is something that is difficult to address, because obviously the leaders, they are not psychotic in the sense of being completely detached from reality. They know how to operate reality, they know how to manipulate reality in order to change it. In a way, on an operational, instrumental level, they don't believe their lies, obviously, because they are, you know, they also are careful to know what different people think, and so on. They are reading polls and so on. But on the other hand, they believe in a truth which eventually is the ultimate truth, which, in terms of the leader, not the followers, it relates to whatever the leader thinks. Because the follower is like, just take the back seat and, you know, accept whatever the leader says. But for the leader is, I mean, and you know, and these leaders always talk about this. It's like, I know, before I think about it, I know what is truth. Then that's another, you know, more philosophical issue, which is truth what we already think, or is something that we can observe? And then you have two very different understandings of what reality is or should be.
Right.
I mean, and one last thing, that's why they have a lot of problems with science, which is about demonstration, empirical demonstration.
Yeah, so it's an active, it's a matter of faith, it's a political theology, it's an ideological closed system. Let's move to wannabe fascists. We talk about populists concentrate power, they target opponents, sometimes demonize them. They don't use violence nearly to the same extent as you said. Racism is not something that's part of their, it can be elements of it, but it's not central to it. Wannabe fascists. So lots of names that are in the book: Donald Trump, Narendra Modi, Jair Bolsonaro, and others, Duterte in Philippines and so on. So you call them wannabe fascists. And so this is one of the big debates. You know, are we, one hand we say we're worried because a lot of the ways in which they exercise power, how they mobilize people, how they speak, the norms they create or violate, so on, bear striking, disturbing resemblances to these early classical fascists. And that's clear in the book. It's it's jarring. You know, you sort of read a quote from Mussolini, and then you read a quote from somebody, you know, who's leading a country right now today, and it sounds exactly the same. So that's the continuities you talk about. But then you say they're wannabe fascists. Now, you can think about wannabe in lots of terms. I sort of think of the way I grew up. Wannabe is a pretender. It's not real. You know, I'm a wannabe prime minister. I'm not really the prime minister. You know, I'm a wannabe great athlete, but I'm not really. So wannabe is sort of like they kind of aspire to be, but they're kind of fake. You know, not to even to use their own term, fake news. So, you know, the question then becomes, and they're bound, at least now they're testing it, they're eroding it from within, but up until now, right, the democracies in which a lot of these leaders have arisen, they haven't provided the checks we expected. So you have a January 6th. But then some of them have been defeated, right? So Bolsonaro tried to do the same in Brazil. The Supreme Court there was much more powerful than the Supreme Court in the United States. He was charged in jail for over 20 years, right? Duterte lost an election. So if they're wannabe fascists, how we should take them seriously. They are threatening and doing a lot of damage. But does that mean that at some level they also pull back? Because that's something else that comes through in the book. Often Federico say, you know, and this is a good thing, they lack the nerve, the leaders we're talking about, they lack the nerve to go the full, you know, to take a project to its full extent. So they'll use violence, but not nearly to the same extreme as in the past. They will lie, but not to the level of the past, and so on and so forth. So I guess that's the question, right? Some people would say you're right to call them fascists as an adjective. They're fascist politicians, but they're wannabe fascists. So our democracies can contain them as long as people mobilize against them. Opponents do. On the other hand, people say, you know, that you're maybe exaggerating the threat. So how do you deal with that?
Well,
that debate?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think I'm exaggerating the threat. That's for sure. You know, in the U.S. we had a coup d'état, and then the question is this kind of back and forth. I mean, I will divide like the answer in a couple of different layers, very different, let's say, dimensions of this. One is that, you know, Mussolini said, and I quote him in the beginning of the book, Mussolini also complained about this kind of people. He said, like, there are the fascists who are fully committed, and there are those fake fascists who, you know, they are all the time listen to public opinion, they want to see what people think, they wait. And Mussolini complained about that, as he would have complained about Trump. And then, you know, that's the silver lining, I guess. But also the most important dimension is that when they are listening, they are also listening to us, they are also listening to other, you know, to other members of the state, to people in the judiciary, to people in the military, and so on and so forth. I mean, January 6th he was not successful because many people, like in important spheres of the state, did not agree with that. In fact, the most powerful general at the time, he later said he was thinking about the risk of Nazism. That's how he conceived of what happened then. And as you might recall, Trump said, like, go there, I will go with you. He didn't. And then there is, so that is one dimension, the lack of resolve, you know, the taco part, if you follow this taco, you know. In a way, that's good. That's good. Yeah. I prefer a taco rather than a Mussolini. That's for sure. Mussolini, for example, he knew, because everybody told him, that Italy maybe should have entered a Second World War by 1944. Like, they were not ready. He shouldn't. It was bad for Italy. Everybody told him that. And yet he said, this is it's a moral part of my decision. Remember violence and morality, of course. We have to do it. It doesn't matter if it's rational to do it. And of course, as you know, they were fighting in Africa and they had to send Rommel to Africa because they were not ready. And the same happened in other places in Europe. So Mussolini did the wrong rational decision, but what his gut told him. And so there is one thing.
Yeah.
Then the other thing, which is, I think, especially if you don't agree with this, for those of us that do not agree with these ideas of how to diminish democracy or to make it more authoritarian, less deliberative, less rational, less rooted in rationality, the good part is that it depends also on us, because they take decisions also measuring how the people will respond. And I will tell you an example which is, in my opinion, one of the most extreme examples of the history of Trumpism so far, which is what happened very close to here, what happened in Minnesota, in which you have like paramilitary formations claiming to be acting in the name of the state without any sort of identification, unmarked cars, unmarked people, executing citizens point range. And by the way, no prosecution is going on. Like, this is a free pass for these killers so far. This is American right now. And in that sense, maybe, as there was a choice there, another Rubicon. Should they continue, even if people were, as the polls, even Republicans were against, many Republicans were against that, they stopped. A fascist will not have stopped. A full-fledged fascist will not have stopped.
Right.
But again, they are trying, and it also depends on, protest, public opinion, voting. Those are the barriers that, they cannot be defined only by what they want. I call them wannabe fascists not only because I'm analyzing them, I'm analyzing us, what societies do vis-a-vis that, because they pay attention to that.
Right.
My other president, because I have two countries, Milei in Argentina, and when you listen to Javier Milei, who is the president of my country, and then you listen to Trump appears as a very educated, soft, moderated individual. That's the extent of Milei's, brutality.
He had a chainsaw.
Milei said the chainsaw. So Milei said, for example, at some point, he engaged in extremely homophobic remarks during the campaign, and also when he became the president. And in Argentina, I'm very proud to say, we had one of the first laws in Latin America for equal marriage, same-sex marriage. And Milei said, he went to Davos, and in an international context, he said, homophobic remarks, and he wanted to change the law. Now, hundreds of thousands of Argentine citizens demonstrated in all cities in the country. And you know what Milei, the wannabe fascist, did? He changed the subject. So it depends on us too. Eh?
Right.
That's part of the definition. Whereas with a fascist, Hitler would have preferred, and he did die, rather than facing a situation in which he was no longer the leader of a majority.
So let me sneak in one last question.
Yeah, okay.
So we'll try to keep this one brief, then we'll open it up. So the last question is, if this is a threat, and it is a threat, there might be some disagreement on how grave a threat, but these wannabe fascists are threatening democracies in various ways we've talked about. One thing that checks them is reality. They may not believe in reality, but reality exists, right? So the economy tanks, a policy backfires, a war goes bad, and as you say, they're responsive to, as long as they still are trying to contest elections, they have to be responsive to public opinion and so on. The other one, as you were just saying at the end, is that opponents have to mobilize against them. So historically, 20th century, greatest enemies of fascism were socialists. But socialists have suffered major defeats around the world today. So this is, I'm going to ask a set of big questions and see if you can answer it briefly, and then we'll open it up. So if that's the case, can socialists, the 21st century versions, legatees of socialism, revive their fortunes? What about liberals, populists on the left, feminists, champions of multiculturalism, multinationalism? Can they form a broad, durable coalition to check wannabe fascists? Because that's one of the recurring themes. If you look at the history of this fascism, that's what we've been talking about, debating politically for the last 10 years in all of these countries, is can the opposition actually become united and overlook significant, real philosophical differences they may have, maybe strategic, tactical ones, to put forward a broad, united front. And in some countries it's happened, and in others they've struggled, right? So I mentioned Brazil and the Philippines, where you've had defeats, and in India there was a setback, but the opposition is still struggling to form. In the United States, it looks like in complete disarray. The Republican Party itself, I mean, now it's finding a bit of spine, but that's just because the polls are changing. So how do you think about that, about mobilizing against the threats posed by the wannabe fascists?
Well, I mean, these kind of leaders identify anti-fascism with the left, or with lunacy, or with communism. But in fact, historically, at the time of fascism, fascism was left, center, and right. Like, it was a big umbrella against the fascists. And when it was successful, it was because it was that. Now, there are two dimensions here. Like, frankly, it is important, for me, it's hard to understand, on a normative level, when somebody says, you know what, between the racists and the anti-racists, I have no take. I'm in the middle. Between the fascists and the anti-fascists, I don't have an opinion. And I think we have to explain to people having that kind of, in my opinion, mistaken middle ground position, how problematic that is. I mean, and we have to explain it. I think we have to explain it. Because, for example, in Nazi Germany, there were people like Hitler, of course, or Eichmann, that wanted to kill the Jews. But there were also those that say, I'm no friends of the Jews, but also I'm not against them, but, I have no take. You know how we call them in the history of the Holocaust? Moderate anti-Semites. Because, I mean, there is no middle ground between these situations. And I think we need to do a better work explaining that to our fellow citizens. Then the other dimension is, why we have this kind of longing for these authoritarian personalities. By the way, it's the title of my next book, Fascism and the Authoritarian Personality, because I'm interested in why people want this. And one of the reasons is that they are able to be, they kind of displace, and also the propaganda of the leaders displace, real issues relating to inequality that they themselves experience, with a kind of fake idea of racial or religious superiority. And in a way, they are not selling them goods, they are selling them, lies. But that is important, I think, in any kind of anti-fascist or pro-democracy tent, to emphasize this issue of equality, because there is a reason why, in the US Congress, and the same could happen, by the way, at the Argentine Congress, is like the level of millionaires in the American Congress or the Senate is way higher than the level of millionaires in the American population. So there is a problem of representation here. And Republicans, Democrats, why all these people have so much money and we don't? So this is a problem. Now, you go figure why the answer to that is choosing a billionaire. But that's another story, of course.
That's the next book.
But the point is like, why, if they focus only on political rights and not on social and economic rights, right, I think it's very hard to build majorities. And anti-fascists in the 1930s knew that, even on the right.
Right, and it comes after the crash and the depression, and those are the social conditions.